Chapter 17 deals with what we call culture and oligarchy. A few terms to define on this first panel as well. The authors argue that California's governance in the 1870s through the 1890s was influenced by elected representatives who were well connected along with their wealthy patrons. Well, you can almost say that about political action committees and special interest groups today, but some of the conflict of interest back in those days was just absolutely blatant. All right. Terminology. Oligarchy means a government in which the ruling power belongs to a few persons. A plutocracy is a group of wealthy people who control and influence the government, so one feeds on the other. California's writers at this time, in the 1870s and 1880s, were influenced by these forces, mostly protesting these forces of governance. California writers, even though California was relatively new as a state, and only at this time were people really moving here, after the gold rush. California writers are producing a remarkable portion of the country's most significant writing at this time, which is kind of interesting. One figure is Henry George. Henry George was the editor of the Oakland Transcript in 1870. He denounced the railroad as the state's largest private landowner and as the beneficiary of vast subsidies in both land and cash, and we certainly know that from previous chapters. He wrote a pamphlet called The Subsidy Question in 1871. It pointed out that the railroad had not grown by free competition, but by monopoly and government money. Henry George advocated a single tax to confiscate privately owned land. Then there was Ambrose Bierce, another critic of the railroads. He was described as a bitter man, mostly due to the economic and emotional hardships of his early life, i.e. his childhood, which I believe was in Ohio. He went to San Francisco after the Civil War. He wrote for newspapers including the Newsletter, the Argonaut, the Wasp, and the Examiner. And amongst his works were scathing editorials against the railroads, especially against two of the big four, Stanford and Crocker. He was described by the authors as a deeply tortured individual. Some say he may have joined Pancho Villa's army in Mexico to seek death, not by his own hand, that he kind of had a death wish. A little bit about Ambrose Bierce. Frank Norris. His family moved from Chicago to San Francisco in 1882 when he was 14 years old. He studied in Paris. He studied art there. He attended UC Berkeley for 4 years, and then he took creative writing at Harvard after that for a year. He is considered the first important contributor to the writing style of naturalism by an American author. His famous novel about the railroad oligarchs, which actually came out in 1901, called The Octopus, departed from his goal of naturalistic objectivity. So this style was certainly a departure from, this book was a departure from his main style. He also had a project that he had in mind. The Octopus was supposed to be part of a trilogy called The Epic of the Wheat, which you no doubt are reading about if you're reading the chapter. Then there was Jack London, who was born in San Francisco in 1876. He was essentially an orphaned kid, grew up on the waterfront. After a semester at University of California, Berkeley, he joined the Alaska Gold Rush in the late 1890s and collected a great deal of material for writing stories from which he hoped to make a living. So, success in the gold rush itself was not a big, was obviously not on the offing for Jack London, but its experiences up there, he was hoping to make a profit on. He was discovered by American publisher S.S. McClure, who published London's Son of the Wolf. His most famous novel was Call of the Wild, 1901, as when it was published. He, too, was a tortured soul, as, well, I guess many creative people were in those days. He died in 1916 from alcoholism. There is a Jack London State Park in Sonoma County that you can visit. It's his former home. Hubert Howe Bancroft, by 1859, was the most successful bookseller in the West, and he decided to bring together in his bookstore all the items that dealt with the Pacific Coast, history and natural history and so on. And this was the beginning of the Bancroft Library, which is famous today in Berkeley. He started writing something called Bancroft's Works, which is a history of the West, which was a subscription type of deal. In order to raise money to write this and do research, this was paid for by his subscribers. He only wrote about a quarter of the works and did not give credit to his staff, who wrote most of it. Specifically, a fellow by the name of Henry Oak, who actually wrote about three-quarters of it. The biographies in this series, called The History of the West, Bancroft's works, I mean. The biographies, in length and tone, were dictated by the amount of money that came from the biography, the person that perhaps Bancroft and his staff were writing about. So it was a very patronage sort of thing. Now, let's move on to newspapers. Lords of the press. We cannot ignore William Randolph Hearst. Yes, the same man who was responsible for the building of that posh residence in the mountains above Cambria, the Central Coast, Hearst Castle, which you can visit now, which is a state park. He was the son of George Hearst and Phoebe Apperson Hearst. He took over the San Francisco Examiner on March 4th, 1887, which was the day his father was sworn in as a U.S. Senator from California. He was the purveyor in journalism of those days of the arranged story. Basically, it's like this. If the news that actually happened at the time was not lively enough, he manufactured news that was. So I suppose you could call it sensationalism. He, in his empire, acquired an unprecedented number of newspapers in the United States and maintained extraordinarily close control editorially of their content. There are Hearst newspapers still today. There are Hearst magazines, and there was a broadcasting empire later on. He actually started many, many radio stations in the late 19-teens through the 1920s and 1930s. James McClatchy should be mentioned. He was an immigrant from Northern Ireland, and he was against big landowners and favored squatters during the gold rush in the late 1840s and early 1850s in the Sacramento area. Later on, he launched the publication of the Sacramento Bee in 1857. He became its editor and owner, and so this began the McClatchy dynasty of publishing. After the Sacramento Bee, later on was the Fresno Bee, which was started in, I think, 1921 or 1922. There was the Modesto Bee. In the early 20th century, they also started radio stations, including our own KMJ here in Fresno, which also started, I think, in 1922. If you know downtown Fresno at all, the corner of Van Ness and Calaveras is significant because the old Metropolitan Museum that is now closed used to be the original place where the Fresno Bee was published and was the original studio of KMJ Radio in the 1920s. And across the street where Valley Public Television is today, Channel 18, that was the original KMJ television studio, or now KSEE TV, was put on the air in the early 1950s. Of course, now they've moved down to McKinley Avenue by the airport, and they have had many, many owners ever since. Harrison Gray Otis gets a mention here, although we will explore him in more depth in Chapter 19. He was a native of Ohio. He arrived in L.A. in 1882. He actually published a small newspaper in Santa Barbara a year before that, but he ended up in L.A. in 1882. A long career as an editor, publisher, and owner of the Los Angeles Times, and was an unabashed booster of his adopted city. Some people praised him as a visionary. Others damned him and called him a reactionary. So you either loved him or hated him, I guess, in the time. He had unparalleled influence on Southern California during this period of time in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And again, we'll explore that in more depth in Chapter 19. There were artists in early California, most notably a German immigrant by the name of Charles Christian Nall, who was famous for this painting in particular, Sunday Morning in the Mines. You can see that in the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento if you go up that way. Additionally, there was a British immigrant, an artist by the name of Thomas Hill, who actually, I think, was commissioned by Leland Stanford to paint this painting, The Driving of the Last Spike, when they finished the Transcontinental Railroad. But it is not historically correct because it has Theodore Judah in the painting, and of course, by this time, Judah was dead. There was a big flap over this painting between Hill and Stanford, if I remember reading correctly, in Chapter 17. As far as education is concerned, public education was dismal in early California, as you have already learned. It was German immigrant Emma Marwadell, who opened California's first kindergarten in LA in 1870, and one of her former students obviously was not a kindergarten student of hers, because if you do the math, it doesn't work out very well. Kate Douglas Wiggin, who must have been an earlier student of Marwadell in a higher grade, taught the first free kindergarten class in San Francisco in 1878. There was a protest that was started in the early 1870s by Irish immigrant teacher Kate Kennedy. She launched a lobbying campaign for equal pay for equal work, equal work, that should say, not equal fork. Man, my typing is terrible. Equal pay for equal work for teachers. The vast majority of teachers and school administrators at this time were women, but they were not paid as much as the men were for the same positions. So, as a result of her lobbying, the California legislature in 1874 did pass a reform dictating that female teachers and administrators should receive the same pay as their male counterparts. Let's talk a bit about the University of California, which was originally the Contra Costa Academy, a prep school for boys. It became the College of California in 1855. 11 years later, the California legislature passed a charter to start an agricultural, mining, and mechanic arts college. The College of California had land north of Oakland, which they turned over to the state, which was then merged with the above proposed college. There was an adjoining town already laid out in this land north of Oakland, which was named after Irish philosopher Bishop George Berkeley, who hoped to found a college in colonial New England many years before. So that's how the city of Berkeley, California got its name. The University of California was chartered officially in March of 1868. Joseph LeConte is significant because he was one of the first East Coast scholars to come to the West Coast to teach at a major university here. It was difficult to entice such people to come out to the West Coast, but one who did come out was Joseph LeConte, who was a biologist and philosopher who won admiration with his writing and lectures on what he called evolutional idealism, in which he reconciled Darwinian theory with belief in God. I think there was even a lodge named after him at Yosemite that he stayed in, and there was some controversy over that a few years ago in the national park. It is important to mention Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who was the wife of George Hearst, the mother of William Randolph Hearst. She took her son, William Randolph, to many, many tours of the arts of Europe when he was a young boy. She became a tireless patron of the University of California and maintained that educational opportunities should be available for women as well as young men, established thousands of scholarships for women, and the recipients of these scholarships were known as Phoebes in her honor. Then there was Leland Stanford Junior University, aka Stanford, named after Leland and Jane Lathrop Stanford's only child, who died at the age of 15. It was started at a farm that the Stanfords owned in Palo Alto. Stanford became known as the Harvard of the West, and Harvard became the Stanford of the East. And at the time, it was doubtful whether two universities, i.e. UC Berkeley and Stanford, could exist within 50 miles of each other, but those doubts disappeared rapidly, and certainly have today, when you can think of the incredible amount of innovation that has come out of both of those institutions. The high school curriculum at this time was established by the legislature, and it was designed to be college preparatory in nature. Here are some other colleges of note. University of the Pacific, which started in San Jose in 1851 by Methodists. It is now in its home in Stockton since the early 1920s. USC, University of Southern California, a Methodist school, started in 1879. Occidental was started by the Presbyterians in 1887. Pomona was started by the Congregationalists also in 1887. And Whittier College was started by the Quakers in 1901. The Baptists started University of Redlands in 1909. And California's normal schools, which eventually became the CSU system in which you are taking this class, began in San Francisco in 1862. The oldest women's college in the West is Mills College, which was originally opened as a seminary in 1871 and chartered as Mills College in 1885. And that, my friends, is Chapter 17.